This belongs to you.
Okay. Do you want me to try and
Speak. Test. Test mic.
Yeah, it sounds like it's working.
Okay.
Okay, so
Hello.
ignore everything about these microphones. So you exactly push to talk. Turn it off if you're not talking.
Yeah.
Okay. Stand by. I'll give you in a second.
No. You, Amina. I'm doing the end.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Big picture.
I was told it was the other way.
No. Ready?
5, 4, 3.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Asad Rahman from War on Want and a member of Demand Climate Justice. Welcome to our opening press conference of COP29. This COP, much closer to the microphone. I'll do that again. Good morning, everyone. My name is Asad Rahman from War on Want and a member of Demand Climate Justice. Welcome to the opening press conference of COP29. This COP is taking place against the backdrop of a genocide unfolding in Palestine by an apartheid state and a planet and its people being sacrificed to climate violence by the richest and most powerful countries. I want to hand over to my esteemed colleagues who will be speaking about the big picture, some of the big issues at play here at the climate negotiations, the fundamental issues about climate finance, and the false solutions that are being proposed by the richest countries. So over to you, Meena Raman from Third World Network.
Good morning, friends. Can we have some silence in the room so we can hear us? So we are once again at the COP29, another COP, and I hope certainly that we will have some positive outcomes, but the situation is looking rather bleak at this moment. Most importantly, the world's largest historical emitter and current per capita emitter, the United States. We all know about the Trump administration coming in and how they are going to walk out of the Paris Agreement once again. And it won't be no surprise if they also walk out of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So you have the biggest polluter of the world, historically and currently, abdicating its responsibility on doing its fair shares of the emission reductions. Last year in Dubai, the big news, headline news, was countries agreeing to transition away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. However, what you have, the Trump administration and the agenda is the drill, baby drill. So with the US not being reined in terms of its emissions reductions or for contributing to climate finance, you will actually see the ramifications and implications pretty serious. Because if the US was not a major emitter, the issue would not be a problem. But it is a very large emitter. And in this sense, we already have seen that the warmest temperature on record, 2024 this year. We've seen the devastation around the world. We have seen forest fires, we've seen droughts, we have seen heat waves, and those who are the poorest and who have not contributed to the emissions are paying the price already. So this is going to cloud the talks. And what we hope is that the other developed countries do not hide behind the United States. They used to hide behind the United States. They have no more excuse. Now they have to come front and center to actually see whether they will own up to their responsibilities. But it's not looking very good. The Baku COP has been heralded as a finance COP. This is the most important issue for the Global South. It's about finance. You can't talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels. You can't talk about a just transition. You can't talk about needing adaptation finance and addressing loss and damage with no money on the table. We cannot be negotiating the size of the zero. This is not what the COP ought to be. So the developed world has to deliver on the promise of public resources from developed to developing countries. But what they are doing is to distract, and they are having a smoke screen by saying that there would be an investment goal. They are saying, yes, it is about the trillions, but there's an investment goal. We are not talking about an investment goal. This is not about everybody having to contribute from domestic resources, from the private sector, from the international financial institutions. This is a new collective quantified goal on finance from the developed world to the developing world. And it's not because it is aid, it's not because it's charity. Climate finance is rooted in historical responsibility, and let's not forget that. And it's not about the new contributors. There's a big push to include China, Saudi Arabia. I heard this in the BBC this morning and really made my blood boil. This is not about developing countries stepping up to the mandatory obligation that developed countries have to do. It is about the developed countries paying for what they have not paid up for all these years. And if we take the climate debt into question, the developed world has already exhausted 4/5 of the carbon budget for limiting temperature rise to 1.5. They owe us a climate debt. I'm sure Claire will talk more about that, but let's not get distracted. We have to ensure that the Baku delivers on the finance. And the other issue, and why you see the plenary likely to be delayed, is what's called the UAE dialogue. And this is an agenda fight. As much as those of you who have not been to COPs, agenda fights are very common. But this agenda fight is actually a substance fight. This is about the global stockade outcome on what's called paragraph 97. The dialogue is supposed to be about finance, but the developed world do not want the focus on finance. So what they are saying is the dialogue should be about all GST outcomes. It has to be about mitigation. That's what they are pushing very hard on. The point is, it's very clear in the decision that the paragraph 97 of the dialogue is under the heading on means of implementation and finance. So don't distract and take this away from the very important issue of finance. And this is what we fear the developed countries will do, all about distracting from putting finance on the table of public resources of what they owe the developing world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Meena. Claire.
Good morning, everyone. We've been talking about climate finance for decades, and yet here we are again in another round of empty promises and stalling. I remember coming to previous COPs and repeating that this is the finance COP, that this COP is one where climate finance will be finally addressed. And every time, we're met with more finger-pointing and blame games. We fully expect the same in Baku. The Global North will again come to the table with great ideas like let's all pitch in, let's bring in the private sector, let's expand the contributor base. And when the Global South pushes back against this burden-sharing, multi-layered, profit-driven approach, we'll be painted as the ones delaying the progress. But this isn't about rejecting ideas. It's about standing up for what is right. It's about justice and accountability. The issue is clear and undeniable, and we have become a broken record repeating this. Climate finance is the responsibility of those who caused this crisis and continue to fuel it. The Global North, with its decades of environmental exploitation, has a moral and legal duty to fund climate action in countries that contributed the least to this crisis, yet bear the heaviest impacts. This obligation in countries outlined in the Paris Agreement, and I refuse to believe that the governments of the Global North are too ignorant not to understand what this means. They simply don't want to pay up. So for those still pretending not to understand, let me reiterate one more time. Climate finance is a form of payment and reparations for the massive climate debt the Global North owes the Global South. It is payment for generations of emissions, relentless resource extraction, and the staggering losses and damages we in the Global South continue to endure because of the Global North's failure to act. And as payment, it must be public in the form of grants, not loans. It is not a payment if we're expected to pay it back or if the payer profits of it. That's not payment. That's pure exploitation. It is their blatant attempt to cheat their way out of their obligations. And we in the Global South are united in our demand the NCQG must be public, grant-based, and deliver at least $5 trillion per year. We want the $5 trillion free from the constraints of profit-seeking investments. It should be new and additional to existing commitments. It should not be treated as charity or donation, but an obligation. They owe us a huge climate debt, and the payment acceptable is only grants. This $5 trillion must cover not only mitigation and adaptation, but must include loss and damage and just transition. Loss and damage cannot be sidelined or offloaded onto MDBs and the private sector, whose primary approach is to offer more loans or insurance mechanisms, because loss and damage is a direct result of the Global North's inaction and failure to meet their obligations. It is only right and just for them to pay up. And to those who are asking if the $5 trillion per year is attainable, the answer is a resounding yes. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the Global North's financial capacity as they quickly mobilized a staggering $16 trillion in fiscal stimulus to support their own economies. Additionally, the G7 alone spends $1 trillion a year on wars and conflicts, the same governments that claim that they can't afford to meet their climate obligations. The resources are there. Their excuses are nothing short of insulting. If the global north can prioritize military spending and pandemic relief, it must also prioritize climate finance. And at this COP, we, the civil society from the north and the south, will make sure we will flood the halls of this stadium, our voices thundering in unison, demanding the governments of the global north to pay up. Our call for justice will shake the very walls, leaving no corner untouched, ensuring that they hear our demands loud and clear. They will have no choice but to face us, and they cannot ignore us any longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Jax.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jax. I'm from Ibon International, a member of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, or DCJ. I'm from the Philippines. I actually come from a province in the Philippines called Albay, which was just recently inundated by unprecedented floods brought about by a number of tropical storms. So it's really frustrating to see and hear that the global leaders, are coming here today talking about more ways that they can drown people's back home and across the global south. And just last night, we received alarming information about the Article 6.4 supervisory body's attempts to move forward documents on methodology requirements and activities involving removals of Article 6.4 without the approval of states and without formal negotiations. And from our standpoint, it appears the COP29 presidency is poised to gavel this process through the plenary, and we are outraged by these developments. It's important to note that these recommendations on removals have been rejected twice, and those on methodologies were rejected last year. And instead of reflecting on these rejections, the supervisory board is now attempting to bypass the authority of the CMA, the COP. They're subverting the Paris Agreement and the entirety of the UNFCCC COP process. And apart from undermining established procedures, a big frustration for us is the fact that false solutions like removals are still on the table. Have we not learned from history? Because history tells us that these mechanisms distract from real and lasting emission cuts and have adverse impacts on communities, on the rights and livelihoods of communities worldwide. They drive land dispossession, they undermine food sovereignty, erode democratic control over resources, privatize global commons, exploit labor, and intensify basically the most damaging aspect, the most destructive, the most harmful aspects of the capitalist system. We have been very categorical. Any mechanisms premised on allowing polluters to continue business as usual, to continue to justify fossil fuel use, or to persist in colonizing and plundering the global south is not a solution. That's why, apart from insisting that these texts undergo the proper review, we demand that all removal mechanisms, including markets, offsets, and other dangerous distractions like geoengineering, even the jeepney phase-out and the building of megadams back home in the Philippines, they must be struck out from conversations about solving the climate crisis because they simply do not. And additionally, if this is gavelled today, we are very cautious that this will open the door for more private finance flows for the new climate finance goal, or the NCQG, which was discussed earlier. Early adoption of markets could justify this and enable the global north to skirt their obligations to provide public finance by reducing the significance and presumably the amount of public finance contributions from them for the global goal. This is not climate finance. We're very clear with that. Carbon finance, or finance derived from markets, from offsets, from removals, is not climate finance. Climate finance must not come from mechanisms that harm the very communities it aims to support. Fully operationalizing carbon markets on the first day of COP29 would send a discouraging message for a conference that promises to deliver on financial commitments. And is this the early win that they're really after? Because if so, let's just abandon any pretense of COP29 being the finance COP and call it for what it truly threatens to be, the false solutions COP or the dangerous distractions COP. Because if COP29 is to be the finance COP, it must respond to the urgent needs of the global south, where people are literally fighting for their lives against rising seas, floods, super typhoons, heat waves, and drought, driven by the global north's insatiable thirst for profits and for power. Rather than financing fossil fuels, false solutions, as well as wars and genocide, the global north must pay what is owed to us. They have an obligation to provide adequate, new and additional grant-based public finance. I won't be expounding on this further because it was discussed earlier by our esteemed colleagues here. And this finance must be directly accessible to frontline communities and should not be used to prop up more false solutions, but is used towards supporting real community-led solutions, those led by indigenous peoples, by women, and by other marginalized sectors. This is the way to building a fair and equitable climate finance goal. And we will not rest, trust, we will not rest until these demands are met. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jax. Before I open up for any questions, let me just also add a few words. We meet here as these words echo throughout the world. Extermination, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, illegal occupation, starvation as a weapon of war crimes, crimes against humanity, ecocide, genocide. These are just some of the legal descriptions by the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court, the world's highest courts, as well as countless human rights experts, describing the ongoing violations of binding international law by Israel in its war on the Palestinian people. Laws that every government here is legally bound to uphold. Laws that underpin the very human rights framework within which the Climate Convention is situated. For decades, we have witnessed a systematic campaign of settler colonialism, racism and violence that echoes the centuries of violence faced by indigenous and other peoples of the global south. Gaza has been turned into rubble, left uninhabitable, a deliberate policy of dispossession and dehumanization. The bombing of homes, the siege of Gaza, the illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank, these are not isolated incidents. They are manifestations of a calculated strategy aimed at erasing a people, their culture, and their right to exist. And even as we sit here, more and more of our colleagues are being deliberately and systematically killed. For under the rubble of Gaza lies not only the rotting bodies of men, women and children, but the moral reputation of rich developed countries. For they are sending a very clear message that the lives of those in the global south are worth less than others. And this is the exact logic for over 500 years that justified the policies of exploitation and extraction that has taken the planet to the edge of catastrophe. And we as global civil society cannot turn a blind eye to the suffering inflicted by a system designed to perpetuate control and violence. For this is not just an attack on the Palestinian people, this is an attack on humanity. And as the UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk said this week, it's an attack on the UN itself, its institutions and its mechanisms by those, many of those who sit across from us in the plenary, the US, the UK and the EU, who will make hypocritical statements about human rights and climate justice while arming genocide, financing genocide and seeking to criminalise and silence those who speak up for justice. For the horrors that are being faced by the Palestinian people are not just a distant tragedy. They are a consequence of deliberate actions by those governments. This COP has been talked about as a peace COP. This COP has been talked about as a finance COP, a COP where there is absolutely no shortage of money to finance war and conflict by the very same governments that claim there is no money for climate justice or for climate action. They are willing to spend trillions in arms sales. They are saying they are willing to burn down the very institutions of international law and the rules of law which underpin any future hope that we have of tackling the climate crisis. And that's why global civil society, we not only say stand with the Palestinian people, but defund genocide, fund climate justice. Thank you, and I will open for any questions. Take woman here.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Those were very interesting. It struck me that it says on the wall as you walk in here, keep 1.5 degrees within reach and leave no one behind. That's literally the writing on the wall as you come into COP29. Apologies, I'm Shauna Kaur. I'm a reporter from Ireland. But really, I suppose my question is, we already know that 2024 is on track for beating 1.5, and this COP is again another finance COP. It feels like last year was a finance COP and the one before that was a finance COP. And I've heard that there are sort of moves away from what was included in the final text last year, a transition away from fossil fuels. And when that's what the world really needs, do you think finance is being used as a delay tactic when there are no deals done on that final deal? And when will we have a COP where we agree to phase out all fossil fuels, because that's what needs to happen?
If there's anyone else, I'll take three. So, blue. Yep.
Hi, Tim Stickings from The National. I wanted to follow up because you were saying the developed world needs to step up in the Trump presidency, but the German government's just collapsed, the French president isn't here, other G7 countries aren't here. Do you think that those countries are actually losing interest in climate action? Thank you.
I'll go this way. Mina, start.
Yeah, it is actually quite worrying to hear what's going on politically around the world. Yes, the German government has collapsed, and also what's happening in other parts of the world. But I think the point here is that there has to be, if this regime is to work, there is no other alternative but to own up and do what is needed. Now, I don't know, I'm not from the German civil society. I think German civil society is united with us. So I do think that we have to do everything possible to make it possible that finance is on the table. What's important is that, as my colleagues have been saying, there are ways to do this. You can remove the trillions of fossil fuel subsidies. You can shift money from funding wars, bombs, and genocide. So there are ways of doing it. You can impose wealth tax on the billionaires and the millionaires. So these are not impossible positions. These are possible. Even if northern governments are having difficulties, they should facilitate the mobilizing of these kinds of mechanisms, including even what's called the IMF special drawing rights. 650 billion was mobilized through the issuance of an IMF currency. So if there is a political will to do so, there are ways of doing so, regardless of what problems that governments are having. So the issue is, you can do it, you have to do it, and the political will is what we see lacking. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you. We've been told to wrap up, so I would just say one thing. At the heart of this climate negotiations and the fight for the last 40 years has been the right of everyone to live with dignity and harmony with our planet. We can do that. This is not, we know what needs to be done in terms of transitioning away from fossil fuels, of ensuring food is a right, of protecting people's lives and livelihoods, of fixing our rigged global economy. We know the solutions. What we lack is the political will. And the failure of political will by the global North governments is what is opening the door for far-right authoritarianism and right-wing populism. This is a moment for solidarity between people of the global North and the global South. We're for a shared future. As we know, when we entered this climate negotiations this week, the UN emissions gap report says we're heading towards a warming of 3 degrees by the end of the century, that we will have lost potentially 2 degrees within the coming decades. We are the final generation that could say it's within our hands the decision about what kind of world we will leave. And so I'm told we have to shut up. So thank you. Our colleagues will be here if there's any more questions. I'm losing interest.
Thank you all, and thank you for respecting the time. No, that's good. That's very kind of you. I know there's a lot of passion.